Hello there. Newsweek's Eleanor Clift is with us now. Hello there, Eleanor.
Good afternoon.
Hi there. And you've got an interesting take, really, on a video that many of us saw last week. It was former President George Bush, Bush 41, breaking down, sobbing in tears at a Florida leadership meeting while he was paying tribute to his son, the Florida governor, Jeb Bush. Let's listen to a little of that.
The true measure of a man is how you handle victory and also defeat. So in 94, Floridians chose to re-hire the governor. But they took note of his defeated opponent, who showed not merely with words, but by his actions what decency
Eleanor Clift, you're writing about this, and you say that those tears were triggered by a complicated stew of emotions. Tell us about this.
Well, he was there honoring a very successful son who was leaving office after 8 years with 53% approval. He's the ninth highest approval rating among the 50 governors. Mm-hmm. Nothing to cry about. But he was recalling that Jeb Bush actually lost his first try for the governor's seat in Florida in 1994. And that was the year that George W. Bush was running in Texas. And the expectations that year were that W would lose against the popular Ann Richards in Texas and that Jeb Bush was a sure winner in Florida. Well, there was some last-minute shenanigans in Florida, but in any event, Bush lost to the Democrat Lawton Chiles. And so the family had a plan to launch the winner, which they presume would be Jeb, for the presidency.
Yeah, frankly, so, they always thought that Jeb Bush was going to be the president, not George.
In fact, I believe on Inauguration Day, or roughly when this president took office, Barbara Bush was quoted saying, "We always thought Jeb would be the one."
Right, I remember that.
And so Jeb is a conservative. He's an intellectual. He's the more studious of the two. He was always the good son, if you will. W was always rather rebellious. But W became the president, and I think that this crying jag by the former president took place really just 2 days before the Iraq Study Group made public its report. I'm sure he knew what was coming, that this would be an indictment of his son's leadership. And I think this is very painful for the former president because he's an internationalist. He didn't favor the Iraq war from the beginning, apparently, if you believe the people closest to him. And so I think he's carrying around a pretty big burden of emotion about what's going on. And I think that the event in Florida, those tears were triggered by those memories.
And the way this has come full circle now in terms of some of the people from Bush 41's administration and from his circle actually, forming the foundations of this so-called Iraq Study Group and now trying to advise Bush 43.
Right, and I'm sure that it must irritate the son to see Newsweek's cover a couple of weeks ago that said father knows best. And now you have President Bush going on this very public listening tour and hearing what everybody else has to say, and setting aside the fact that I wished he'd conducted this kind of investigation within his administration months, if not years ago. But he wants to now come up with something that he can say is his own. I think he does not want to be seen as just taking his father's friends' advice a whole cloth.
Well, I do go back to something you wrote, and I said it at the beginning of this interview, which is this, that those tears by Bush 41 were triggered by this complicated stew of emotions. And you write about what you think or believe is the current president's need to outdo his father and vindicate his father's inability to get reelected. That is a complicated family.
That's right. He wants both to better his father and he wants to heal the father's defeat. And when you look at his policies, first the hiring of Donald Rumsfeld, the first Bush never trusted Rumsfeld, and it's documented in the Woodward book that he counseled against hiring him, and this president went ahead anyway. The resistance to international policies, I mean, the first Bush made his mark by assembling this broad coalition and doing it under the banner of the UN. And so the policies the son has adopted really are very opposite of the father's. And, I think, though, he has actually vindicated the father's loss in the sense that he's made his father look very good compared to the reckless way I think the son has conducted his foreign policy.
All the possible motives and whatever drove George W. Bush into Iraq and into that war. He said himself at one time that he was angry at Saddam Hussein because Saddam Hussein tried to kill his father. So you didn't necessarily write about this, Eleanor, but I throw that into this whole mix as well.
No, I would agree. This was a policy that was driven by a lot of personal needs, and you could also say much the same about Dick Cheney, who, after all, was the Secretary of Defense the first time around and counseled against going into Baghdad and overthrowing Saddam. I think he came into office the second time with a sense that he hadn't finished the job and wanting to finish the job.
You talked a little earlier, we're talking with Eleanor Cliff, by the way, of Newsweek. And Eleanor, you write this week about the Iraq Study Group. Some people call it the Iraq Surrender Group. But you say in terms of this president, he's down to his neck in quicksand, and that this study group has thrown him a rope. Do you really think he sees it that way? Because he seems to side in some major parts with those who think the Iraq Study Group has it all wrong.
Well, the Iraq Study Group certainly had it right, I think, in pronouncing the current policy a failure. And I think the plan for success, if you will, I don't actually think that kind of plan exists. And I think this would have been, if he accepted it, would be a way to mask defeat. I think it's probably the less bad of a number of bad options.
Right, you're saying
I'd be surprised if they come up with anything better, and I think what President Bush would like to do is simply, he wants a do-over. He wants to restart the war, but I don't know where he would get the troops for that from.
Well, some of his rhetoric, and we have only a few seconds remaining after this, some of his rhetoric seems to sound the same. This is the president this week.
The reason why that's vital is because Iraq is a central component of defeating the extremists who want to establish safe haven in the Middle East, extremists who would use their safe haven from which to attack the United States.
He's saying this week it's vital to stay at it, and he pronounces the stakes to be the same as they have been for him all along.
Well, it's campaign rhetoric, but I wouldn't put a whole lot of stock in it. Ever since he fired Rumsfeld after declaring he'd be there until the last day, I think this is bravado. If he doesn't change strategy and sticks with the status quo, the public is going to notice that. I don't think he can get away with that for 2 more years.
Eleanor Clift, good as always to talk to you. Thanks.
Thank you.